So, good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's lecture. My name is Enrico Borghetto, and I'm a political scientist, and I'm a teacher also here at the University of Florence. And I'm your host today. So the lecture is part of the ValEUs Open Lecture series. For those of you who do not know it, ValEUs is a Jean Monnet policy network, and the long title, I have to read it, is Research and Education Network on Contestations to EU Foreign Policy. So the network undertakes interdisciplinary research. They have Jean Monnet module, implementing resilience and recovery plans in Italy and beyond, which I have the privilege of coordinating here at the University of Florence. So today's lecture is titled EU Practices of Recovery and Rebuilding in Ukraine, and I cannot stress this enough. It's really that this topic is highly relevant as it explores the EU's commitment to its core values right at its borders. So the challenges posed by Russia's aggression in Ukraine, along with escalating global tensions, put the Union's dedication to human dignity, freedom, equality, and solidarity to the test. Therefore, I'm confident that the insight shared by our speaker, Miranda Loli, will be especially enlightening today. So, Miranda is a distinguished political scientist specialized in international relations. Her research examines the role of international organizations and the ways local non-governmental actors navigate and shape the international arena. She is currently a Max Weber Fellow at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute, and her latest work has focused on how recovery during war is contested and negotiated in practice. So, we agreed with Miranda that today's lecture will last about 45 minutes, followed by a Q&A session. So please join me in welcoming Miranda Loli. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Enrico. Thank you to all of you for being here. Thank you very much also to Laura for co-organizing, and to Andrea. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to talk about this topic today, particularly since I'm sure many of you have heard very recently we had 1,000 days of war. So since February 2022, Ukraine has been defending its territory against a war of attrition. And this part of recovery processes have been, in my view, as I will try to argue throughout this presentation, also central to its defense strategy and the rebuilding of damaged infrastructure, attracting foreign investments to prevent economic collapse, as well as a wealth of bilateral collaborations are part of what I consider throughout this presentation, recovery governance. So the goals for today will be to first try to address the continuities as well as the ruptures, both in the EU, in the way it makes its integration policies, in the way that it does foreign policy, but also in its relationship with Ukraine. Throughout this presentation, bear with me because I will have to move through time before and since the war has started, and try to also address what has been going on in EU policymaking in Ukraine. And I think this is a very important point because many people would say, well, the accession process has been going at a very fast pace, or how can it be that the association agreements have been signed so fast? But if we try to look a little bit more closely at what had been going on already since 2014, in regard specifically to EU foreign policy making, we can try to understand the trends today much more deeply. I will also try to move through space in this presentation between Brussels and Kyiv, so between headquarters of foreign policy making as well as on the ground. The outline then for today would be to first try to talk about what is it that we consider recovery, and what are the many faces of the EU in Ukraine before and since the war. To conclude, then I will try to kind of ask the question of what does this governance of recovery mean in practice for the changing role of the EU as a global actor in the world. Now, I'd like to start by saying that this presentation is a lot about a tale of two elephants. And the first elephant is, of course, the main elephant in the room. How can you talk about recovery while there is a war still ongoing? Isn't there a dissonance there? And I would argue, yes, there is. The starting point for this presentation is in itself a dissonance, because we are not used to talking about recovery during a war. We talk about it more as post-conflict reconstruction. And that has been a big part of sort of the global liberal order and its responsibility to protect, as well as its responsibility to rebuild, that I will try to rediscover a little bit in this presentation. So the starting point of this presentation is definitely one of dissonance, but I would like to, with you, try to listen to the dissonance and see what it is that we find in it. The second big elephant is another proverbial one, which fewer people might be familiar with, and that is the tale of the blind touching an elephant. I don't know if any of you have already heard about this. This is an Indian proverb of, if you would blindfold a group of people and have them touch an elephant, they would touch certain parts of it, and they would consider this to be something completely different. So if they would touch only the trunk, they would think that this is a snake and not an elephant. If they would touch only its back, they would think that they're touching a wall. If they would touch only its legs, they would think that they are touching a tree. And here I follow a group of Ukrainian scholars who recently compared the recovery governance also to this elephant. So if we just see the macroeconomic budget support, we think of this only as an economic project. If we look at the building of the war archives and the way that we are trying now to sort of document what goes on in war, we think of this as a transitional justice project. So very often in this incredible, monumental task of rebuilding and recovery, we only see certain parts of it and not the entire one. So today I will try to take a step back. I will show you a lot of the sectoral parts of it and a lot of what has been going on in different issue areas, in different ideas of infrastructure that are being putting around, but we should a little bit try to keep the big picture of this recovery elephant in mind. So, as I mentioned, if we try to take a step back when we think of recovery, the question that we should be asking at this particular sort of juncture in time, in my view, is can we rediscover the responsibility to rebuild? So already in 2016, there was a paper entitled "What Happened to the Responsibility to Rebuild?" I'm sure many have heard only of the responsibility to protect and the interventions that have been done in the name of the norm of the responsibility to protect. This has been also a very contested norm, but there is much less talk of the responsibility to rebuild. And this is, of course, because already similar to the responsibility to protect, the top-down interventions that were particularly emphasizing liberal frameworks for peace and reconstruction, in part also privatization of resources, they have mostly been considered a failure. Next to the responsibility to rebuild in the 90s, there was a new kind of framework that emerged, namely the idea of infrastructures for peace. And this is something that the UN has tried to push for very much. This can be considered as a very dynamic network of different structures and mechanisms that are aimed at conflict prevention and also at peace building. Now, the problem with this way of thinking so far on rebuilding and recovery is that this is mainly set in post-Civil War settings, and this is not the case here. So speaking here of peace building does not necessarily address the challenges of people on the ground. And as some of my interviewees have tried to highlight, one particular narrative in this recovery and rebuilding infrastructure that is currently being built is that they would say, we don't want to be another Afghanistan or another Iraq. We don't only want foreign companies to come in and foreign governments to make all of the decisions about what gets rebuilt where, but we want to actually be an active local voice in this. If we take even a further step back in thinking about rebuilding and reconstruction, we don't only end up in the 90s and in the liberal frameworks there, but we end up in the Marshall Plan, which I'm sure you have all heard about. So this is also an important narrative in this idea of the Marshall Plan 2.0 for Ukraine, which has resurfaced as a pivotal reference. And this is a point that throughout the material that I've analyzed of recovery planning documents and also throughout interviews, this is something that has been picked up both by policy experts in Brussels as well as by their Ukrainian counterparts. And it has resurfaced sort of as a narrative of rebuilding already as early as 2022. And it gained a lot of prominence in policy discourses. To give you an example, the German parliament engaged in an in-depth discussion on the Marshall Plan for Ukraine on the actual anniversary of the original Marshall Plan and considered its relevance more current than ever. This, in a sense, is also being juxtaposed to reconstruction and rebuilding in Iraq and Afghanistan as examples to avoid and the Marshall Plan as an example to emulate. So this idea is very powerful and very mobilizing to say this will be a monumental task, but it also might have an ambivalent impact in part. Firstly, because it presupposes an hour zero, so an actual end to the war. And what we see so far and what has been sort of emphasized in interviews so far is also that there will be times of more or less war and times of more or less peace. And I would argue here also spaces of more or less war and spaces of more or less peace. So there isn't really an hour zero. Yet it has been very much picked up. And the title that you see on this slide, From Martial Law to Marshall Plan, is something that was described to me in an interview by experts in Brussels who said the Ukrainians came very prepared, and already in 2022, their reports would have titles like Moving from Martial Law to Marshall Plan. So it is a very strategic narrative in itself as well. Now, if we are to engage in a process of historical learning from the Marshall Plan, one important point that has been highlighted is the idea of starting reconstruction as soon as possible. And the second one, which you will see sort of throughout the examples that I will give in the Ukraine facility, is the idea of marrying reconstruction with European integration. And here the argument is that the original Marshall Plan itself was also very much driven by economic integration in Europe. Now, a third quite important point that gets forgotten here is also having a transparent reform continuum that moves directly from humanitarian relief to macroeconomic support. So instead of different agencies doing different things and working in silos, because they are highly specialized in only doing humanitarian relief or only working on sort of financial help, to have a more clear continuum between the two. And the integration, as I mentioned, that I will show throughout this presentation, is also sort of a point to that. A third point that is a lesson learned, but was not the case in the historical example of the Marshall Plan, is the inclusion of civil society. And this is a point that has been very much fervently pushed by Ukrainian voices as well. So I think we would do well to interrogate this afterlife of the Marshall Plan and to see where is it used strategically and what does this concept then bring in actual policy debates. Now, a space where this kind of interrogation is very much happening is, of course, the Ukraine Recovery Conferences. I don't know, have any of you heard of the Ukraine Recovery Conferences? This is very fascinating to me, that it's not necessarily something that has been, it's something that gets sort of sometimes mentioned on in media, but it's not something that is very much at the foreground of it. And the interesting thing about the Ukraine Recovery Conferences is that there's sort of this space where negotiation over not only policies, but also business and private actors' inclusion is happening. The first one already happened in June 2022, so only a few months after the beginning of the war, in Switzerland. The second one happened in London. The third one was this year in Berlin, and the next one will be in Italy. So there is a lot of discussion at the moment to try to see what priorities will Italy also set next year in the Ukraine Recovery Conference. And the question that I want to pose in sort of future research is also, have there been any learning effects from this conferences from one year to the other? So as an event, it helps to mobilize international support, but each of these conferences has introduced different sort of issue areas that the hosting government has also very much put on the agenda. So for example, at the URC in London in 2023, financial guarantees and political risk insurance for reconstruction efforts were introduced. That means that if you are a private business helping Ukraine rebuild, for example, you're a construction company, and you are worried that you might also get bombed and lose a lot of your assets there, and Ukraine can, of course, not take over the cost of the insurance as it would in another non-war setting. The European Union and the member states are the ones actually providing this kind of insurance for companies. That means that foreign direct investments would then be more likely because they would have insurance from the EU. So this was an important point of discussion in London. In Berlin, the focus was to try to have different issue areas. So they included a business component, a social and a human component, a local one, as well as an EU dimension. So the key economic dimension that was present in the Berlin conference was again, borrowing also from the previous one in London, the idea of de-risking investments, with guarantees in this case also from the G7 countries. So this would be state-sponsored investment support programs and also a dedicated business advisory council that was also launched to promote private sector engagement in Ukraine reconstruction. Now, as already you might be wondering, isn't this also an issue? So isn't this big idea of recovery and reconstruction also about profiting of Western companies? And that is always the case with big recovery and reconstruction issues. So we need to also wonder in the future of this project, how do we then link this more to Ukrainian companies as well? A second important sort of dimension that was added in the last recovery conference was also the idea of decentralizing efforts and municipalities. So Ukraine has been going through a big decentralizing reform already before the war, and municipalities are an important actor with which the EU has been actually cooperating. And the idea here would be that instead of going only through the national government, this reconstruction projects should also be in a direct link between EU and municipalities, because they also know best what they actually need on the ground. And this has also been included in the allocated Ukraine facility. Now, the EU dimension is the idea of, as I mentioned before, trying to marry the reconstruction with integration reforms. So While the EU accession process promotes reforms, this process needs to be developed with a keen eye towards also sustainable recovery for the economy and for the institutions. So there is this continuous support from the conference, but still it is very much dependent on delivering on EU reforms. Lastly, the human dimension. So the conferences also function, as I mentioned, as a space for negotiation about what should recovery be about. Because it could be about basically everything, but what should the priorities be? And so the human dimension that has been mentioned so far, and that very much also came up in my interviews, is also the idea of having a feminist political economy of recovery. So at the moment, it is mostly women-led organizations that are doing all of this work on the ground. And how can we make sure that it is a gender-responsive recovery process, and in this way also learn from rebuilding, from failed ideas of rebuilding before. So as I argued, this is a space for negotiation, but it is also an important marker of time, because since the beginning of the war, when every year there is another conference, you can sort of see how much time has passed since the war, what has been learned, and what pledges and commitment can be made public in this. In this sense, to try to sort of go a step into theorizing what has been going on, I would argue that the recovery conferences are where communities of practice are being built. So the concept of communities of practice has been used very much in EU foreign policy building or other issue areas of the EU, and is defined by sort of three key components, namely the idea of a shared repertoire. So a community of practice would also be sort of people in this room. They know what the rules are, they meet regularly, they are engaged in a common endeavor of learning, and by meeting regularly, they learn the rules of the game. So they share a kind of repertoire of one person is sitting and discussing, the others are listening, later on they ask questions. And this community of practice is also being built around recovery by meeting continuously, by learning from each other. I would argue that the community of practice extends beyond sort of the institutions of the EU to also include Ukrainian institutions. And of course, there is contestation here, as there will always be. But there is also a building of this community in practice, in this joint enterprise. And there is continuous mutual engagement, which is why I think that the recovery conferences are an important mobilizer of this community. Now, I kind of told you about the conferences in itself and about this emergent community of practice, but what are the actual hard facts of aid so far? So what does the EU and other countries have already sort of committed to Ukraine? So in this first graph, you can see for the period from January 2022 to January of this year, what has been committed. And the three different colors represent the financial, the humanitarian, and the military aid commitments. So as you can see, the EU is the first one in terms of financial commitments. The US then has a much bigger portion of military commitments. And the humanitarian commitments remain similar throughout the first big three. Now, it's important, however, to remember that these are just commitments. In the second graph, you can see the difference between the committed versus the dispersed actual budget support. So this goes only into the aid that is being given to the government of Ukraine for its own budget in order for it to be able to continue to function as a state, so also to pay pensions. And here again, the EU is at the very forefront, but there is a difference between what is dispersed and what is allocated. And this is the data until June 2024. Most of the graphs that I will show throughout this presentation are from the Kiel Ukraine Support Tracker. I highly encourage you to check it out if you're interested in this, where you can sort of see different kinds of aid and allocate for different donors and so on. So this is one of the main trackers that the EU also quotes. Now, here again, over time, you can see the difference between the committed and the allocated aid, this time for all three types of aid. So financial, military, as well as humanitarian one. So the dotted line represents the actual commitment here, and in the bottom part, you can see what has been allocated so far. So it's important to keep in mind that there is this big difference between the two. Now, how does the EU actually give military support, which is a fairly new feature of EU foreign policy? It does so primarily through the European Peace Facility and also through the member states. So the European Peace Facility is a very experimental, I would say, relatively new instrument to do this. Yet it is still a portion of the entire military support. So most of it goes through the member states. And now a very last pie chart. I don't usually have so many numbers and so many graphs in my presentations, but I will only show you this last one from the European Union fact sheets for three particular reasons. So in this one, you can sort of also see the different kinds of aids. I would say the first reason to show you this is that if you see at the top, the 17 billion are actually aid funds that are made available to the member states of the European Union for needs of Ukrainian people fleeing war. So when you hear very often in media that we are dispersing this much aid to Ukraine, when it's not military aid, actually a big portion of it goes to the member states and not to Ukraine itself. So this is the first reason why this graph is important. The second reason is because it also offers a much more sort of issue area breakdown at the bottom of it. So you can kind of see through which instrument it goes to and what is it actually being used for. So at the very, very bottom, the 30 million at the bottom corner over there is for nuclear safety cooperation. At the very top, it's for the Ukraine facility in Brussels, which will coordinate most of the aid and which also is based on EU integration reforms. And I will talk more about the Ukraine facility in a moment. So here you can kind of also see what goes to humanitarian assistance, what goes to energy and emergency, and what is also specifically for civil society. So around 31 million of this aid goes for civil society, who is in charge then of, I would say, also monitoring the entire process and making sure that it is locally owned in a sense and transparent. The third reason why this graph is important, and we are almost done with numbers, is this very tiny part over here, the 1.5 billion, which are from the proceeds of Russian immobilized assets. I don't know if this is something that has been on your radar. It came up very, very recently. So the idea here was, again, at the very beginning of the war, to use the Russian funds from frozen assets in European banks for actual support of Ukraine. And for a very long time, this idea of making Russia pay, I mean, long in relative terms here, I'd say for the first 2 years, this idea was very much considered something that would never happen. So it would be too much of a precedent in global financial markets to actually use the funds. It would create a moral hazard. It would destabilize the system too much. And yet, recently, it did happen. Now, in fact, it's not the assets that were used, but only the proceeds from these assets. So only the interests from these assets are now being used. And while at the beginning, there was also a big contestation, at least also from the pre-conferences of recovery that I've attended, whether this money should then go to the military or actually to recovery. And the EU version of this was that it should only go to recovery. This was before this taboo was broken with the EU military assistance. now, at the moment, it is 90% to the military and only 10% to recovery. So just the money that goes from the Russian immobilized assets. And I think it's important also here to really excavate how this came to happen. So you will mostly see the pictures of von der Leyen and Zelensky shaking hands and when this is all done and when this is signed. But there has been a very concerted effort from Ukrainian activists that you see in the second picture to push this in the agenda, not only at the recovery conferences, but also through demonstrations. So the activist in this picture with David Cameron that I've interviewed is called Olena Halushka, and she has been organizing demonstrations since 2022 with big receipt bills of 300 billion calling for making Russia pay. And David Cameron was one of the first, I say, European politicians who embraced this idea and also said it at the London conference. So this was, like I said, considered a taboo for a long time, yet while it is still very small compared to what activists have asked for, yet it also represents a break into how recovery projects are funded in practice. Now, it's also important to keep in mind that the EU is not the only player here. So in here you can see this sort of snapshot from the UN and particularly the UNDP, which has also been very active. And I think it's important to keep in mind that UNDP or UN Habitat have a very long experience in this kind of recovery projects, and the EU has been very much engaged in collaboration with them. So Borrell has also recently signaled a much deeper collaboration between UN and EU on this particular issue. And I think the UN kind of also, as you can see here, is in part funded by the EU. So EU help to Ukraine goes not only through sort of EU capabilities, but also through UN on the ground, which has this much more practical experience in it. And here I think you can also see that already a lot of programs are sort of ongoing on the ground. So it's not a question of sort of only planning and preparing for recovery, but it is also a question of this has been already going on. And here in the map, you can sort of see projects that are already ongoing in different regions. And here it's, again, important to keep in mind that what we know from the recovery and rebuilding literature and the responsibility to rebuild and so on is that this processes of rebuilding and of allocating funds also create inequalities within a country. And one particular question that has been posed here is why so many funds go to not necessarily the most heavily bombed oblasts and regions. And can we have a kind of allocation of funds here that keeps in mind also the actual destruction? But as you can see, the biggest part of this funding by sector is going to infrastructure projects at the very top, and the second biggest one is going to social protection. Now, like I mentioned, while the EU has been engaged in this process of learning from UN, also specifically from UNDP on the ground, the way that it is doing sort of most of its rebuilding and recovery planning is through the Ukraine facility. And this is a very sort of new way of doing this, and it has three sort of main stakeholders, namely the local authorities, the civil society, and the private sector. So it is also coordinated by a multi-agency donor coordination platform with a lot of donor countries and also countries beyond the EU. And it has three main pillars. So the Ukraine plan, which is the first pillar, sort of supports with grants and with loans. So we should also keep in mind that a big part, as in many other recovery processes, a big part of this is also through loans and not necessarily only grants. And this is, as I mentioned before, support for the reforms that are needed for EU accession. The second one is the investment framework, something that was negotiated also at the recovery conferences in terms of de-risking mechanisms for investors. And the third one is actual technical assistance for the governance. Now, how does the EU legitimate that it needs this new tool? Why did it need this new tool? So the way that it is currently being legitimated is that a new coherent and integrated policy response was needed. So instead of having integration and accession policies on the one hand and the EU security and defense policy on the other hand, and different actors working at the same time with different issues, that it should have one coherent mechanism and one coherent tool. The second way that the existence of this new tool is legitimated is because it offers predictable funding for the period until 2027. So it wouldn't then only be dependent on vetoes from certain member countries. It wouldn't only be dependent from EU election at the parliament, but it would offer a sort of long-term idea. Now, and this, of course, this predictability is very important for Ukraine and for international donors, also in terms of thinking of this recovery and rebuilding idea as part of the defense strategy. Now, I'm sure some of you might be asking, okay, so what about the actual absorption capacity of Ukraine for this aid and for these programs? And one point that gets often discussed here is the question of corruption. This is an important narrative that has been used strategically from the Russian side. It has been also used strategically from different EU member states. So there is some point to it, yet it is also a strategic narrative. And I'd like to sort of say a few words on the absorption capacity and in terms of corruption, because this is an issue in sort of all big interventions and recovery processes. And we know this also from a lot of literature on, specifically also from Sarah Chase. It's a very interesting book, I think it's called Thieves of State, of how corruption then erodes the state, particularly also in a post-conflict scenario, which this is not yet. And here I'd like to say, so interestingly, there has been a lot going on this topic before the war has started. And the EU has been involved in creating a myriad of institutions at the local level in Ukraine. It has helped in creating the high anti-corruption court, which was also a set of international experts that actually elected the local judges in Ukraine for the anti-corruption court. It has created a lot of new prosecution institutions, or helped create them. And besides sort of this institutional level, there is at the moment also a digital infrastructure of recovery going on. And this one in Ukraine is called DREAM, namely the Digital Restoration Ecosystem for Accountable Management. And where this comes from is a previous sort of digital platform of electronic procurement, where the motto was everyone can see everything and everyone can check everything. That was previously also called Prozoro, which means everyone can see everything, and transparency in Ukrainian. And the idea there was that if you are a normal citizen, you can take a picture and upload it onto this platform of any road that has been destroyed or any construction site that is not going according to plan. And you could see for every project the procurement data on that, which companies are being responsible for it, how much is it costing, and so on. So there's this sort of big digitalization in Ukraine being used by civil society to combat corruption for a very long time. And the interesting thing for me is how this infrastructure that was there to combat corruption is now being used to keep track of the destruction of the war. So what was used as electronic procurement before now is being used to see where is something being destroyed, what kind of projects are there going on for this particular region, for this particular street, for this particular bombardment area even. And here you can kind of also, everyone can see it, everyone can open everything, and this is also creating First, a kind of accountability, I would argue, because the Prozoro e-procurement platform, while it was first an activist idea, it then became necessary by law for all procurement projects. And there is currently a draft in place to also make this dream infrastructure be necessary by law for all procurement projects. So there is, interestingly, a lot going on in the fight against corruption, despite being in the midst of a war. And here, taking it with a grain of salt, I would show you the Corruption Perception Index. I've criticized this index a lot in previous work, but it is sort of the main measure being used by international organizations to measure corruption. And the interesting thing here is that while Ukraine scores very low, it has actually been on the uptick despite being in the midst of a war. So I think when we talk about the fight against corruption, we should really try to focus also on what is being done against corruption and put that also as part of our perceptions. Because, of course, corruption exists everywhere, and there's different entry points, and the possibilities are very high at a moment where there is a high influx of aid. But it matters to sort of see what is there in place actually at the institutional and at the civil society level. So it's a very sui generis case in which this index would go up during a conflict. And for context, in Germany, there is a much better score on the Corruption Perception Index, but it has been going down in the last years. So I'd argue also that it's not only the level of corruption that matters, but also the tendency in this index. Now, what does this mean for how we think about the EU? Sort of zooming out from the ground and going back to the EU institutions. What are sort of the many faces of the EU in Ukraine before and since the war? As I mentioned to you already before, there is an integration process that had been going on already since before. So the visa liberalization agreement was already signed in 2017. And for that, different reforms on the track to EU accession had to happen. And the agreement towards association was also already signed in 2014. So this, of course, also had a lot to do with the Euromaidan revolution, as many of my interviews would call it. So the EU has already been very much involved in this process of integration, even though when we look at it today, we might think that a lot of things have happened very fast in the last 2 years. What gets less discussed, however, is the involvement of EU in border management and in security foreign policy in Ukraine, also for quite a long time. So the EU border assistance management to Ukraine and Moldova was namely one where the EU first tested its border management capabilities in 2005. And the EU security sector reform assistance mission, which was then deployed to Kiev in 2014, was also an EU security mission on the ground already before the war. And as many of you might know, the EU is engaged in different security and defense engagement around the world. So here you can see the military, the civilian missions throughout the world. Now, the interesting thing for me is that Ukraine is the only country that has 3 of these missions. 2 I've mentioned, one in the border, one in Kiev, and since the beginning of the war, also a military training mission, which here, as it says, it's actually housed in EU member states, but it means that Ukrainian forces can be trained on European soil. So it is, first of all, the first one to have 3. The EU border management mission that I mentioned before was considered a big novelty at the time, and it was very much related to the Orange Revolution, where the EU saw a window of opportunity actually to enter into Ukraine. And this mission was also considered the future of border enforcement at the time. Now, what has this mission been also doing since the war? It has also continuing to train people on how to manage the border in Ukraine. So it has still been active, even though, as it's often the case with this European civilian missions, they are supposed to have primarily a training component, and yet you might wonder, when are the people sufficiently trained? Can this go on forever? But in this case, the EUBAM has now extended its stays multiple times and has been very active also already since the war. So I sort of try to call this from one revolution to the next, from one mission to the next, because with each revolution in Ukraine, as you may, the EU kind of had a new opportunity to deploy another mission, and it took that. So the second mission, the EU assistant mission with the so-called Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine, was deployed in 2014, and the way that sort of interviewees described this is that it's basically about rebuilding almost every large sector of the Ukrainian state from scratch. And again, this is something taken from already 2014, and the idea of seizing and building the state as it should be. So there is a long history of this here. Now, as I said, the military one, it's completely located on EU soil, so it's not a mission on the ground in this time, but it is also open to third country participation. And I'm not sure how many of the other missions around the world are opened to third country participation, but this is definitely not the general case for all of them. One particular EU mission where this was the case was in Kosovo. And the training here, as I mentioned, is sort of supported by the provision of equipment, and is also provided in parts both by the member states as well as the European facility. And my argument would be that the reason why this was so quickly deployed was because it could build in part from previous missions. So there is a learning effect going on at the EU from one mission to the other, and from the headquarters to the ground and back to the headquarters. So there is a feedback loop here. So to sort of conclude, the growing pains of the European Union in this new role, I would argue, are not only in terms of enlargement. The idea of the growing pains is something that is used very often when we talk about how the EU is enlarged, but they're also growing pains in terms of its changing and growing role. And here there is currently a debate going on of whether can the EU do this growth only as a kind of crisis mode diplomacy, building also from the way that it reacted to the COVID-19 crisis with new experimental tools and with much faster decision making. So it also learned how to react in Ukraine because it was involved in this crisis mode diplomacy between states during the COVID-19 crisis. Or is the EU, to put it then more provocatively, sort of a diplomacy of broken promises, and the way that it has been active in the Western Balkans for a very long period of time, but promises have not been kept despite reforms being done. And so Jones and Angel have called this also a diplomacy of broken promises. And will this also be the case in the next sort of iteration of EU foreign policy in Ukraine? In the sense, though, I would just like to sort of point out that it's both a maturation by design of the EU, but also very much a maturation in practice. And here I follow sort of Federica Bicchi's work of trying to juxtapose the maturation by design of what goes on very much at the institutional level in the way that the EU sort of creates these new tools like the peace facility, like the Ukraine facility, but also very much of it is just decided in practice. And there is, of course, a sort of third elephant to this entire story that I'm sure you will ask more during the question time on sort of the EU post-Trump election. And coincidentally, the Republican Party also has an elephant as its symbol. So what does the post-Trump election mean then for this growing role of the EU? And can it learn both from and also in a crisis? So in a sense, while there are a lot of open questions for how the EU will evolve, I would argue that this kind of recovery governance, whether it's sort of recovery implemented on the ground, or whether it's just recovery planning, or whether it's this new set of governing mechanisms and actors and communities of practice, actually helps the imagining capacity, both of the EU and of Ukraine itself. So while it is very much dissonant, it is also a gateway to actually being able to imagine a future post the war. And in its sense, then recovery is both a programmatic agenda, but it's also a concept at work. So it does something for the way that we think about Ukraine and its future. It does something for the way that we think about the EU and its future, despite the fact that there are these clashing temporalities of recovery and of war. And as I hope to have sort of tried to convey to you, there is this emergent community of practice that has been negotiating both the way that they see time, sort of what should happen when, and the way that they see space, who should be involved when, in which sort of negotiations. And here there are still both continuities and ruptures and learning circuits from CSDP missions on the ground that are informing EU foreign policy making. And I sort of close with a picture from Ukrainian artists group on that maybe some of you saw already at the beginning, on sort of the idea of tomorrow and rebuilding. And I think that this kind of also illustrates what I've been trying to say about the imagining capacity in this issue. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very much looking forward to questions. I was okay on time.
Absolutely, and not, absolutely. So thank you, Miranda. And so you actually delivered on your promise. You took us on a, let's say, on a travel through time and space. And thank you for this very interesting presentation. It was very encompassing in the sense that you covered a lot of ground. And so we know for sure a lot more after listening to it. So I will open the floor to questions. Is there any pressing question? Who wants to break the ice? Please.
I have two questions on this series of Ukraine Reconstruction Conference. Is that the correct proper name? Thank you. The first one would be about the point that you make that, in your opinion, and I think it's proved by evidence, that these conferences were not mainstream in media, like they were not at the top of media priorities. Do you think that this is due to the interest of the general population, or it is somehow also wanted by the organizers of the conference to favor more hidden diplomatic negotiations to make them more efficient? And the second question would be about the same conferences. Do you think that they are always organizing goodwill, or especially now after the Trump re-election, would there be an occasion to push for some, peace treaties that maybe consider less the just peace element and only the peace element? Thank you.
Okay, maybe we can elect another question before moving to the answer. Anybody else? Do you want to?
Thank you. Thank you very much for your highlighting speech. Very, very interesting speech. And, well, I have many questions, but the first one is how much you have shown very well that member states have their own strategies and policies, and so how much this is a conflictual field. I mean, how much member states' policies are in conflict, and influence EU strategies in this field. Yeah, at the moment I stop here. Thank you again.
Okay, so.
Should I start? Thank you for both questions, and particularly also the question of conflicts. That is something that is very hard to research in itself. But maybe I'll start first with the first question on the Ukraine recovery conferences, and that is an interesting point of why was it not much more broadly mainstreamed. So you can find certain snippets of it, of a couple of hours on YouTube, on the public parts. This, of course, is not necessarily very much debated in media, so you wouldn't know unless you know. That's a little bit the tricky part here. But I don't know if it's what the reasons for it actually are. So it's actually very hard to get, even as an academic or as a journalist, it's very hard to get into this recovery conferences, because I tried and did not get security approval, despite trying to sort of go through institutions and sort of through formal organizations that had connections and so on. So they definitely have like the more negotiation part of it, and then they also have the more open part to it, where sort of also civil society is now being invited. And here on this part of what is public and what is hidden, there has also been, I'd say, a change, because it was contested that at the very first one, civil society from Ukraine was only able to be at a pre-conference day and not able to actually be at the actual recovery conference. And there was a lot of disapproval of this, understandably. So at this year's in Berlin, they were able to actually attend the conference. So that is, at least for Ukraine, civil society ones. Now, in terms of sort of, is it also for efficiency reasons, if I understood your question correctly, in terms of diplomatic negotiation? I would argue that probably the real in-depth diplomatic negotiation goes on somewhere else. What is very much prevalent here is this matching between also businesses and municipalities, or businesses and particular Ukrainian local actors. And of course, for that, I would probably also understand that there is an efficiency component to it. Yet, if we then argue that the process should be open and transparent, I would say civil society organizations should have a much bigger role here. And then sort of your second question on the peace element, well, actually, I think that goes on also in the peace conference, which is another event. Yet, in terms of also the conflict situation, I guess this goes on there as well. So, as I mentioned, it's very hard to get security clearance for this particular conference, but what I was able to attend in fieldwork were also the pre-conferences that were organized in Berlin, where you will have German foundations, European foundations, German parties, EU Commission members and institutions. And that, to me, was sort of the most dissonance space that I had ever been in, because you would have von der Leyen having a speech in the one room, and the Ukrainian ambassador in Germany having a talk there with sort of the members of the Ukraine facility, and you would have in another room sort of Ukrainian scholars, queer feminists talking about Russian imperialism. So there was a space in this pre-conferences for all different views on the issue, for talking about colonialism, and also a space for von der Leyen to sort of have a geopolitical agenda. So these pre-conferences, and interestingly, it was called Café Kiev, which was a cinema in Germany that used to be called Café Moscow and was renamed since the war to Café Kiev. There is sort of a generative space where you can have different voices present. It can be done in part, and it remains sort of for me to be seen how it will evolve in the future in terms of these yearly recovered conferences. And is it then also conflictual? So first, maybe also to the conferences. This next year it will be in Italy, and it is not yet very clear of sort of what the issue priorities will be there. There is already, through one interview that I can try to sort of quote here, but that I would still have to sort of corroborate in practice, there is this idea that Italy would try to decouple more military assistance from recovery assistance, so that it would try to sort of see these two things more as disconnected as opposed to sort of connected. So that, I think, is a part of the conflictual space here. Where can we see it is a little bit more the question. You can try to interrogate it in interviews. You can sort of try to also do that through field work, but that is not necessarily something you will find in documents in itself and through document analysis. But I think this is one particular conflict. And yeah, I'm very curious to hopefully then be able to go to the one next year in June in Italy and to try to see what the priorities will be there.
Okay, let's collect another round of questions. Anybody? Please.
I'm just wondering, because you mentioned the crisis decision. Hello. Yeah. I'm just wondering, because you mentioned the crisis decision making, which has made decisions more efficient. But has this crisis decision making bypassed individual say of member states? And has it endangered the actual representation of the people? Because there is a lot of moments that the EU Parliament has noted that they're being bypassed on many occasions regarding the conflict resolution and decisions regarding this conflict. So I was just wondering, is this a slippery slope?
Any other question? So I might take the opportunity also to ask a question. So I don't know if we talked about it, but okay, as part of this, my Jamone module, I organized this course entirely devoted to exploring the recovery and resilience facilities and the plans that are organized in every member state. And so while talking and analyzing the governance of these plans, what came up is that there are some problems. One of them is, for example, some sort of excessive rigidity, in the sense that they are inflexible to changing circumstances. For example, they prefer, let's say, milestones and targets, this idea that you have to achieve milestones and targets instead of reaching some, let's say, real objectives, some outcomes, and also some limited local involvement. So what lessons can the Ukraine Peace Facility learn from all these problems, from all these pitfalls, considering also that we are in a situation that is very much politically sensitive and evolving, constantly evolving. So, yeah, of course, we know that the two contexts are totally separate, okay, so totally different. So we are talking about rebuilding after a war, and recovery from the pandemic. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much also for these questions, and they're very well interconnected in a way. So, as I tried to sort of mention with what is crisis mode diplomacy, of course there is some learning that has been going on from the pandemic to the way that the EU has to sort of react so fast in this sort of changing world in itself. Now, does this, to go to your question first, bypass member states, and does it bypass the parliament? Surely in part. But the question then remains, how do we try to still have some sort of transparency in this process. And I think what the Ukraine facility does here, which of course it's at the end point and not at the very beginning, and I understand your question is also about the setting up of these facilities. I think what it does, it does provide some sort of transparency in terms of why was it important, how did it come to be, and does it have a kind of coherence and long-term effects. And I think here it's important to also point to current literature on procedural norms. So there is this difference between sort of norms that are substantive, like rule of law, the fight against corruption, and so on, things that EU institutions and more broadly international organizations adhere to and have as their cornerstones. But there's also the idea of procedural norms. So not only what we take decisions on, but also how do we take those decisions. And I'd say that the fact of the matter is that there isn't necessarily a bunch of procedural norms in place for crisis, but that they're being developed right now. So some procedural norms for crisis were developed through the COVID-19 crisis of how do we take decisions in a crisis situation, and they are being implemented here too. So the idea of procedural norms for crisis is something that I think should be a little bit more considered in this sort of bypassing question. And then I think it also goes a little bit to then Enrico's questions. Thank you so much for that, because I am actually very interested to compare at some point. I'm not an expert on the replanning EU and the resilience and recovery in member states, but it would be very interesting for me to actually compare the technicalities between the two. Once there is also some more material on the implementation on the ground in Ukraine, because of course the issue with sort of this topic is that you can research a lot on what goes on in Brussels and a little bit less of what goes on in Ukraine, just also by the fact that as academics we're not allowed to travel to Ukraine for sort of ethic review reasons. I wouldn't actually be able to travel because it would be considered dangerous as part of a university project. So I've been able to conduct these interviews only because I had done a previous project in Ukraine and therefore had connections since before the war, or I've been able to interview people that are very much on the ground but had to move and had to go to Brussels and so on. So it would be very interesting, I think, to compare even on the ground level, but in terms of the excessive rigidity that you mentioned, and in terms of the milestones and targets, that is definitely an issue here too. And this has been, I think, also in terms of the conflict, not in member states, but in sort of Ukraine discourse as well, this idea of does European integration help us in this situation or not? Because it does add a layer of rigidity to reforms. So there have been interviewees that said this is, of course, great, and that was our goal to begin with. It's very important that we are on this path, and there have been also others that have said it doesn't help to have this extra scrutiny from the reforms that we have to adhere to in European integration in this particular situation, because it makes the processes much slower, in also a setting of very much less administrative capacity, just by the fact that also expert working in ministries might be on the battleground, might have fled, and this is a new kind of added lack of administrative capacity there too. So there is, I think, this excessive rigidity in the process as well, but this is where also alternative kind of ideas come to mind. I don't think I mentioned it in my presentation, but there has been actually a discussion also on doing this differently and having, this is a proposal by Ukrainian economists, of not having only the Ukraine facility in Brussels, but having a Ukraine recovery and integration agency in Kyiv, which would also be in charge of both recovery and integration processes, so a sort of a two-track there, but with local autonomy. This is an alternative that they've proposed that, of course, has not been taken up yet. And the idea of that was also, it's an added burden in all conflict and post-conflict scenarios to have to deal with so many donors. So to have to deal with the EU separately, with the donor, multi-agency donor platform, which has UN, US, and other G7 countries, that is an added burden of the local ownership. Why can't we have actually one agency? And if I'm a member of local Ukrainian civil society, or if I'm a mayor of a municipality, I have a one-stop shop. Wouldn't that actually be much more helpful? So there's alternatives of sort of local ownership being discussed there. I doubt that this would be implemented. There is also here a kind of rigidity, even though international actors always say they don't want to duplicate measures. In practice, they do, just because they don't want to have one-stop shop for everything.
Thank you so much. There's one more question.
Thank you, Miranda. The lecture was very, very insightful. You're studying an ongoing and open-ended process, and there are many, many variables, as you said. The third elephant in the room you mentioned in your conclusions, but also the ongoing conflict, like the outcome is still to be defined. As you said, all this discourse on Ukraine recovery and rebuilding is somehow connected to the agenda on EU enlargement and accession of Ukraine, but this could as well be wiped out of the agenda if something goes wrong. So my question is, how do you, how does uncertainty of the process impact your research design? And if you have adopted any methodological strategy or, you know, how you try to control this? Thank you.
Other questions? Otherwise, I ask you, since they're mentioning there is a third elephant, shall I also ask you about a fourth elephant, which is the crisis in Germany? I know that you know the German case very well, but the current crisis, what will be the repercussions of this crisis for the recovery?
I think there was also a question there.
Yeah, please.
I'm just wondering about the long-term viability of all the recovery agencies that are going to be started in Ukraine, because how long do you see this recovery process? Because I'm sure the EU will do their best to implement a lot of recovery aid and to do their best, but how long can they stay? Because I'm sure, are there plans in place to work together with the local authorities so they can eventually leave? What does that look like?
Since you just said that for the Ukraine facility, the main and only headquarter is in Brussels, right, at the moment, and the discussion of decentralized different agency or authority in Ukraine is, it's just talk for now. Do you think that since there has been a positive narrative and framing around the Marshall Plan, this could be used to push for a decentralized agency in Kiev? Because if I remember correctly, there was for the Marshall Plan, there was a central authority in Europe, in Paris. So it was just not that there was an agency in Washington and there was no authority in Europe. So maybe, do you think that this could be used locally for pushing for a local authority? Thank you.
Okay, so you've got a handful of questions now.
Lots of very, very interesting questions. Thank you so much. I'll try to group them a little bit and maybe first sort of talk about the idea of leaving and the agency on the ground, sort of the main topic of what do we see the future also of this recovery, then move on to your very important question of, again, what is going on in Germany, and maybe leave the hardest question for last, because that's the one I'm struggling the most with. Maybe something will come up in the meantime. So on this, I'll start then with the last one. Just a quick clarification on that. So the one that was only based in Brussels at the moment is the EU military mission. So the reason for that is to be able to say we only train we train Ukrainian forces, but we train them on European soil, so we do not have a military presence. So that's the one that is completely only, and that is part of the EU security and defense missions on sort of the big map that I showed you before. Will this change? That is also maybe an open question, because the EU does have missions on the ground in the border, which are only have a training mandate, but they also have advised actually Kyiv on border laws, on also anti-corruption laws. So on the EU military assistance mission that is in only based in Brussels, it's an open question whether that might change or not. I doubt that it will change in the very foreseeable future. Now, on the Ukraine facility, there is in Ukraine itself a new Ministry of Restoration and an agency of restoration that also deals with what I mentioned before through this digital platform, also deals with actual reconstruction on the ground. So I'd say there is, while that is not the Ukraine facility, the Ukraine facility collaborates directly with the Ministry for Restoration. And I do think that there is a lot of sort of space for decentralization. So another Ukrainian colleague has been, Alexandra Koidel, has been writing very interestingly on the fact that decentralization and sort of local resilience in itself were particularly sort of salient in this question, and were the reason, in part, why why Ukraine has been able to resist for so long, why it has been able to counteract the aggression, but also why it has been able to have people remove into their houses after they had fled and rebuild those houses. So the local resilience is very much tied to decentralization and to having powerful sort of mechanisms at the municipality level. And I don't remember the second part of your question. Was it also about sort of the agency? But yeah, I'll leave it at that. Sort of, decentralization is key here, I'd say. On your question of sort of the long term and would they actually leave? That is in itself, I think, for all of these civilian missions, and there's even more experts on security and defense policy, that is in itself a question to ask for all of the EU missions. So I think the EU very recently left its mission in Mali as part of sort of reprioritization, maybe, but I think it's an open question because the EU BAM had, the border mission had been there since 2005. And now the way that it works in itself, you cannot picture it so much as an American interventionist mission because these are mostly seconded experts. So these EU CSDP missions are made from people doing that same job in another member country. So you could be a judge in Poland and go to Ukraine for 2 years on your secondment while you still keep your job as a judge in Poland. Same things for border police and other sort of advisory experts that are kind of housed in ministries in member states and move also from one mission to the other. So they're seconded, and they're not necessarily part of, at least for the civilian missions. So would they completely leave? I don't know, because it's a very, very big endeavor. And the thing with training is you can always say there's more training needed. And you can always say, well, we need to have long-lasting sort of institutions on the ground. And in itself, because they're seconded, it's less problematic than with an actual hardcore interventionist mission, I would say, because they move throughout. And also you could argue that this is the way that then there is a more coherent kind of learning mechanism in the EU by people moving from Germany to Poland to Ukraine and back to Brussels, that this is the way that practices travel throughout, and this is the way that we get a kind of best practices in the end, if you will. I hope that answers your question to some degree. But the question of the fourth element, thank you, Enrico, I hadn't considered that. I would add that to like the next time I present this, hopefully after the elections. I think that is really hard to think about at the moment. So maybe a few words first on the third elephant of Trump. And I do think it's also like reading tea leaves to some point. Like people did not necessarily think that the election was going to be won by Trump, and the day after you will find so many articles on, and this is why he won. So there is always a measurement of tea leaves there. And I think with Trump, the one thing that maybe we can count on is that there is a preference for bilateral solutions in the Trump administration, even if this administration might change, because today we have a list of people that are supposed to be in the administration in sort of the chaos theory of Trump that might change by January, and he is also the president, I think, that has changed the members of an administration last time a record time. So it's very hard to try to see what is going to be the foreign policy based on the people in the administration. But there will be some sort of preference for bilateralism, I think. Trump also said the war in Ukraine will be done in 24 hours once he assumes power. So there's also that. But I think that, yeah, we can kind of count on bilateralism, and then the EU needs to react to that and try to actually push forward more multilateral solutions. In a sense, and the German elephant in itself, that is also, I think that came much more unexpected in a way than there were some tensions already for a long time, and the fact that this coalition was too big. But yeah, also the timing of that was very key here, and how it sort of relates to Trump. It's a very, yeah, I don't know what to say about that, to be honest. Like, that is really an elephant, and that is, yeah. Which sort of government would assume a much more key role in European foreign policy? That remains very, very open. I think if there is a Christian democratic government in place, it would still be very keen on having a similar agenda as so far, but it depends also on how much of a power the more far-right alternative for Germany would get. Yeah. And it's not looking good. Yeah. Okay, so I think we are running out of time. I had the last question.
Okay, yeah, sorry.
Because that's the hardest question, on how does all of this influence the process. Thank you also so much for the question. And can we adjust, like, do I recommend doing a project on something that is ongoing?
I never do it with my supervisor.
Yes.
With the students I supervise.
Yeah, if it would be a PhD thesis, I would have probably also been advised against it, and I wouldn't do it. But I think that there is some value to it if you have a little bit of a connection to the case study beforehand. So the way that I try to adjust it is through sort of a reiterative process, and to see the material that gets collected in interviews and in the documents as a living thing. So it's not a finished thing. At some point, of course, it's a bigger 3-year project. So you have to make cuts and say, well, I'm only talking about this particular time, but you also have to kind of see it as a living thing and try to follow the conversation and try to have as many interviews as possible with the people involved. That's it.
Thank you so much, Miranda. We look forward to reading your findings, and thank you everybody for participating, and see you at the next ValEUs Open Lecture. Bye-bye.
Thank you.